sorry, Matthias, and then I can translate the questions for you. Quiero hacer la recomendación de que si al final de la charla tenemos preguntas, bien las podemos hacer en inglés o pueden ser hechas en español y nosotros de mi parte le ayudaré con la clarificación a Matías para entender esas preguntas. While Matías, the questions are going to be in Spanish. Do you speak very well Portuguese? So in case it is complicated, I can give a hand. Otherwise, I think it's quite easy to understand. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay. So thank you very much for inviting me to Colombia to this third conference, international conference on rivers and wetlands. Oh, what is it? Ah, shit. Oh. Ah, missed. I have to do it again. Moment. So I hope that I can now change my slides. Yeah, can you see my second slide now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I was asked to talk about urban and peri-urban wetlands, and I would like to subtitle my talk as Connecting Land with Water and Connecting People with Nature. I'm holding a UNESCO chair, as Luisa already told you. UNESCO chairs are made for improving the communication across continents. And I'm currently supervising 4 PhD students which have contributed to this talk. Yijin Cao and Xiaozhong Tan from China, Alvin Vasayil from India, and Raita Bala from Congo Democratic Republic. You all know these graphs that we need well-functioning watersheds to provide ecosystem services, specifically those of wetlands. But I want to repeat this important detail that the watershed, the cuenca, is of central importance for whatever management in the landscape and specifically, of course, of wetlands. Very often when we are dealing with urban contexts, we forget this important background. Ecosystem services are known to everybody. However, the ecosystem services of wetlands, despite being well known, are still very badly assessed. The ecosystem services that you know coming from wetlands are flood protection, for instance. Here on the left, you see a photograph taken this July in Germany. A big flood has destroyed many villages and has killed 180 people in Germany because the people have been colonizing a floodable area, but also because the headwater areas were not sufficiently protected. So we have an urgent need to protect them better. Floodplains and wetlands filter water, maintain water levels also during dry periods, which is very important, clean surface water, provide fisheries and non-wood products, and so on. The TEB, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, has published in 2013 a booklet trying to gather the so far available information for assessing economically these ecosystem services. But it has also shown that we really need to improve our knowledge. I've been working a lot on carbon and specifically on the organic matter processing and carbon storage So accumulation of carbon in sediments and in trees is nothing else than the part of the primary production that has not been decomposed or mineralized. So we have a very intensive input of organic matter to the wetlands from the terrestrial surrounding ecosystems, but also, at least in riverine floodplains, we have the opposite movement. So leaves and organic matter get carried by the river and then deposited at land. And the decomposition process is a combined action of aquatic and terrestrial biota. We recently reviewed the processes and the knowledge in general about carbon dynamics in wetlands. This will soon appear in Encyclopedia of Inland Waters. It's quite a complicated graph. I do not want to go into all the details here. The important thing is in this central part, this carbon net storage or release switch, which means wetlands can serve at the same time as a sink or as a source of carbon. And the little boxes in the central park, the green box with the carbon conservation is about maintaining the natural hydrology, but also to protect wetlands correctly in legal terms. And this means we need a well-made definition of what is a wetland and what is not. In many cases, we see that wetlands that an ecologist would clearly define as a wetland are being drained or plowed or whatsoever abused because people do not recognize them as wetlands. So legislation is a very important element of conservation. And then, of course, their sustainable use or their full protection in the case of very erodible wetlands. On the right, you see in the red box the elements of inadequate use that you all know, like drainage, deforestation, plowing or fertilizing, peat mining, and invasive species. In the case of urban wetlands, of course, we have to add the element of just coverage with concrete. Luisa Vega, who kindly introduced me, did her PhD with me some years ago, and her work has revealed a kind of carbon switch. So the longer the wetland is wet or flooded, the more carbon is being stored. And we found out that in seasonal floodplain wetlands, such as the Pantanal or the Llanos of Colombia at the Orinoco, they react like a clockwork to the duration of inundation. So you see here on the right side, the longer the area is flooded, the more carbon is stored. And actually here above and below this zero line in the red quarter, you can see we need about 200 to 250 years per day to get a switch towards carbon storage. But all water bodies are fluctuating not only annually, so once per year, but also have multi-year water level fluctuations. We can see this in the Pantanal, and this is depicted on the left side. If we have longer periods with higher water levels, this is the lower graph here on the left, then you have higher storage of organic matter. Whereas during low water periods, as they just have started in the Pantanal again after about 30 years of higher water levels, these organic matter deposits will be mineralized because they are drying out, and oxygen can transform this organic matter into carbon dioxide. Another Luisa Ricaute, who is also co-organizing this conference, worked on the wetlands in the Colombian Piedmont, and she certainly will have told you about this in her own presentation. what she did was a marvelous combination of different methods. In first place, Luisa has analyzed remote sensing data from satellite imagery and has broken this down into a landscape model. And then she has combined this physical geography, cartography with a social cartography. So she has visited the people and talked to them how they are using the different types of wetlands, and within these wetlands, the different assets that these wetlands provide. So here are some results. On the left, you see the wetland habitat types, and on the right, you see livelihood strategies from this Piedmont wetlands. And you can see that people can use them either directly for hunting, fishing, and so on, or they can use them indirectly, for example, by extracting fodder and food for their cattle that they are raising, or pigs or poultry, or they use the plants as bait for fishing, and so on. A special case all over Latin America are the so-called cananguchales, or in Brazil, buritisais. These are small wetlands formed on source areas, spring source areas of streams, where a plant called Mauritia flexuosa, this is a calamoid palm, is growing in high densities. And it's a very fascinating thing that this buritisai or cananguchales have created a very intensive link between humans and nature. There are more than 100 different forms how these cananguchales can be used. And I found it even more interesting when traveling through Indonesia in Southeast Asia, where a very similar palm is growing, and the fruit there is called salak. And actually the scientific name is Salaka salaka. They really are the lookalikes of the Mauritia, and they belong to the same family, and they exactly have the same intensive use of this palm. So you can really connect a natural feature to a cultural feature here. Now, let's go to the urban part, the urban wetlands. We see them sometimes. Very often we just don't see them anymore. I will talk about this later. But if we see them in the outskirts, we can ask the question, have these wetlands been purposefully maintained, or were they just not yet overbuilt and drained? So very often wetlands in the peri-urban space are just a strategic reserve area for further constructions. In other cases, here in the middle of the graph, you can see that these are more or less just water bodies created by humans without any intent to serve ecosystem functions or to maintain biodiversity. And these are just aesthetic elements. Or on the lower right, you can see a purposefully designed wetland connected to the city, and the people are connected to the wetland. So the wetland has become an urban socio-ecosystem. However, the general policy in most cities is just get the water out, and get it out as fast as possible. So drainage ditches, as you can see it here in this photo, are very, very common, and water, especially rainwater in cities, is still wrongly considered just disadvantage rather than being a resource. And moreover, we have, if we consider the human development on a time axis here from the upper part to the lower part of this graph, we have an intensification of our impacts on nature. Well, in the so-called industrial countries or in the global north, as UNESCO puts it, we have had these individual problems like overfishing or pollution and so on, one by one. And this happened over several centuries. So the organic pollution in Central Europe dates back to the Middle Ages. And today we have more complex problems like global warming, for example. However, in the so-called global south and in the developing countries, these stressors, they are combined. They occur all at the same time. And this causes a very big problem because you can hardly be prepared to solve all these problems at the same time. So what we see in southern hydrosystems, with hydrosystem I want to summarize rivers, streams, wetlands and lakes. We do not only have this classical urban stream syndrome that has been described in the global north for many decades ago, but we have much more problems. So we have often very high temperatures, we have anoxic conditions, we have seasonal rain events with extreme flash floods or droughts, and we have this social component of eco-social disparities or governance that is quite weak, and we have a lot of corruption, unfortunately. So on the right, you see a photograph of a stream in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, courtesy by Kathy Yule, and you do not see the water because you only see garbage. And this photo is actually typical of most wetlands and streams in the global south. And we have summarized the problems that are occurring there, but we also have summarized the results, how people have changed this situation in a paper in sustainability in 2019. So eco-social disparities in cities are occurring all over the world, but they are specifically pronounced in the global south, which means that rich people, they go where the water quality is best, where water is abundant, and where they are protected from floods. On the other hand, the poor people, they are living in slums and in favelas, and they have to live with what is left over, and they really have to fight hard against bad water quality, waterborne diseases. And if they manage to get a better life because, for example, they can produce small home gardening, then very quickly the caterpillars will come and push these people out because this terrain has become attractive for investment in further construction of housing areas. So this is a very big problem that has to be come over by a more social equity in cities. And if we talk about biodiversity, we observe that strategies of organisms, species traits that have been successful for millions of years, like here this frog on the upper left, they turn out to be completely obsolete because a frog, for example, cannot survive on hot asphalt, as you can see here on the lower picture, where the frog is actually eaten up by ants who can deal with the higher temperatures. We also invite many invasive species just by the construction of cities. In Europe, we have ever increasing temperatures, so that many species coming from warmer countries are dwelling better than the current native species, like here, this photograph of a goose species that comes from Africa, from Nile, and is now invading European cities. And lastly, we have excluded fish species, for example, that are migratory by constructing barriers. And while the streams often are just channelized, the wetlands vanish completely. Here on the upper right side, you see in the middle of the central photo, you see this Cattery Lake in the middle of this oxbow of the river. Whereas on the current Google Earth picture, this lake has completely vanished. And it has vanished because leaf litter disposal has been used for conquering land, producing more land. And I thought, oh, this is a typical problem of India. And then my neighbor in Tours in France knocked at my door and he said, look out of your window. And that is what I can see looking out of my window in Tours University. And this entire area has been heightened up by 2 meters with garbage to produce an area that cannot be flooded anymore. So it's by no means, like always, not a typical developing country problem. It is a global problem. And if we would like to make a typology of destruction of urban wetlands, in most cases, it is urban densification and urban sprawl. See here on the lower left, an example from Dakar in Senegal in Africa, from Sidja Badiane, who is one of the co-authors of this paper. We have drainage for water supply or to combat waterborne diseases. You must remember that cities, especially big cities, are deserts. They consume much more water than they provide. And this results in big problems. And so many wetlands have just been drained to produce water, which is, of course, not sustainable. Then we have the cultural disruption, but in most cases, it is just inadequate or absent urban planning. So while rivers are channelized and streams are very often buried, the wetlands really just go away. They are drained, they are covered with houses, and we have to ask the question, how and what could bring them back? As I said, streams, if they have been channelized, they can be daylighted, which means we can open these channels and return the stream to the surface of the soil, which we are currently reviewing in a paper that will soon be submitted. But the wetlands, once they have been drained, they need to be reconstructed from scratch. And here we have a problem. I call it the Teiresias dilemma. Some of you may know Sophocles and the old Greek drama. And in these dramas, in many of them, like Oedipus or Antigone, you find a blind sage, a person that knows what will happen in the future. He predicts to Oedipus that he will marry his mother and he will kill his father, for example, but nobody listens. And I consider us scientists, especially natural scientists, very often in this Teiresias dilemma. We actually know how nature could be restored in cities, but we are not able to be heard. Nobody listens to us, despite we are telling the truth. One of the problems is inadequate communication. This means that we scientists want to publish in high-ranking journals with a good impact factor, but these journals are hardly ever read by mayors or stakeholders or other decision takers. The next problem is that the problems are really complex. So we ecologists, we prefer to make a study that takes 15 or 20 years, and then we can give an answer. But in the meantime, the 5th or 6th mayor is in charge, and he will not even remember that his antecessor has given an order for this study. So we must learn to simplify our presentations, to make them understandable for decision takers so they can be implemented. The next problem is the complexity of the stakeholders' interplay. We natural scientists very often have no idea about the decision procedure, and we have made experiments where we reduce reality to just one parameter that can be changed, and then we look how the system changes in a reductionistic approach. But this is absolutely unpractical if we are dealing with society. So we really need to know the different levels of decision in societies. And of course, ignorance is an activity, which means that many people know the problem, but they refuse to listen to it. And then we have corruption and so on. Yeah. So what can help here? And actually, disasters can help. Here you see two pictures again from Germany. On the upper left, these tremendous rain events in the summer, and on the lower right, an area of the Rhine River which is totally drying out and passing periods with temperatures higher than 25 degrees for longer than 30 days. So the fish are starting to be boiled. A neotropical fish would just smile at these temperatures, but a German fish would just die. So we have these catastrophes and we know where they are coming from. We have removed 90% or more of the natural floodplains and the vegetated headwater zones. Those areas that still remain are in a very bad state. So there is no hydrological buffering anymore. And this results in a lack of sponge effect and excess or lack of water. And the drought is the ugly brother of flood. The flood risk mitigation just by surface sealing and channelization is not sustainable. And we understand this step by step, and the insuring companies that pay for these damages after a while, they are now refusing to pay. And this creates pressure on politicians, and this is a chance for us to improve things, hopefully before it is too late. The second driver is the human health. Why do we need in Europe eat strawberries from Latin America in wintertime? Just because on the southern hemisphere it is summer by that time. Why do we have to put them into airplanes and carry them to Europe? There is absolutely no need for this. We do not need to transform the night into a day in most Central European cities. And we have to reduce the health impacts by unhealthy way of life, especially the increased dust particles in the air, but also noise and also heat, which has, for example, killed 25% additional elder people during the heat wave in Paris 2 years ago. And so we have this One Health approach, which has become very fashionable during the Corona crisis. It starts from the idea that a healthy spirit is living in a healthy human body, mens sana in corpore sano. And now we try to widen this up, that a healthy humanity lives in a healthy planet. But to make the planet healthy again, we have to take a lot of efforts. For example, to reduce our meat consumption. The ecosystem service concept is also a very important driver for restoring wetlands in cities, because they are, as you know, delivering many ecosystem services. They are actually identical or almost identical to those from rivers, and we have another chapter in this Encyclopedia of Inland Waters. Here you see a graph of it, and if we put the ecosystem and the socio-system together, we have a socio-ecosystem. And the ecosystem services are, so to say, a positive collateral effect of ecosystem integrity. I'm still critical to this ecosystem service concept because actually no ecosystem has any interest to deliver a service. It is just an interpretation of ecosystem functions. Living in the rhythm of the waters, well, this is something that I'm preaching here to convince, because in Leticia or in other places in Colombia, people are used to live with floods and droughts for many millennia. And in cities like in Munich, we are learning again to live with it. So here people can walk aside the river during a severe flood event. However, of course, this flood event is somehow tamed. So there is a dam above the city that would prevent from major damage. So we have to learn again how to profit by opportunities and how to avoid the risks that are caused by the high and low waters. And the river culture concept deals exactly with these strategies. And based on this river culture concept, we have currently almost finished. It's about to go to print, this book, with more than 900 pages and written by more than 120 authors, to study how animals and plants, but also how traditional communities are adapted to the rhythm of the waters. And we see on a global comparison many overlapping events. We have similar drivers, but the dynamics of the deterioration are different. So we have, for example, in the fast developing cultures now a very fast advancing damage and loss of cultures like fisheries and so on. The tipping points are approaching fast all over the world. Very often people just forget about how they could live with the river because their grandparents are dying and they are the last people that know it. And so there is no return to good old times, but we need to transform old cultural forms, if they are sustainable, to new functions. For example, navigation that is not needed anymore as a transport can then be used for tourism, for example. And as I already mentioned, climate change can be an efficient driver for action. But mostly it is about people, how they are made aware of the problem and how they then change their ideas. This is the central tenets of the river culture concept. The first point is to reset our valuing, our value systems in river ecosystem management. We really have to acknowledge that floods are not a disaster and we should make use of the flood pulse. The second is that if we adapt our activities to the rhythm of nature, and in this case in floodplains, the rhythm of the water, we can have a better quality of life through a healthier nature. We are living better if we adapt to this natural rhythm. And then to do so, we have two different approaches. One is about learning from the long-term experience of traditional people. As I said, we must be aware that there is no romanticism. We should not copy-paste these traditional techniques. Rather, we have to see how we can transform them. And then we can learn from biotic strategies and innovate technologies as so-called NBS or nature-based solutions. And lastly, we have to recognize that all people within one cuenca, within one catchment, belong together. However, our administrative units are not congruent, are not overlapping with the basin, so we should make the river basin as the basic political unit for decisions about landscape management. And this will be still very hard work to convince the politicians. To get there, it is also important that we go, or not only go away, but integrate more the psychological part of decision taking. What I want to say is that it is valid and important that we deliver good data for rational, evidence-based policies. However, most decisions are not taken by the brain, but rather by the heart. So if we want to move people, we have to acknowledge this human affective world. And in a first step, we should develop a metaphor or a picture so the people can visualize a target, like today our river is dirty and tomorrow we want to have it clean again, or the same for the wetlands. And then we need a narrative, a kind of mental roadmap that connects this target with the history and culture of the people. And finally, to identify the people around this symbol. So the sense of place, that the people say, this is my river and I really want, or my wetland and I really want to have it clean again, is very important. And then they take action. The different elements of action taking go from a totally passive person on the lower part here on this left graph to a highly educated and very active person, which is here in blue and the higher end of this graph. Many sociologists have studied this, and so I don't need to go into details here, but I think it is very important that education and this sense of place play a very important role in it. And my students are currently analyzing this. So Alvin Vasail is studying the so-called community-based conservation initiatives in India, where very poor people are actually taking action and improve their situation. They clean up rivers that have been covered with garbage, and they rip off concrete, and they use more natural fertilizers, for example, and they are getting successful. And the farther they advance, the more the local governments are integrating their actions into policies. This is very interesting to see. And we have 3 different case studies in India with totally different starting points. In one case, it is a Sikh religion that has a kind of helping each other, like in Christianism, which can be widened up to helping your environment. In another case, it is totally a-religious. It is a communist party that is interested in the well-being of the poor people and the workers that are living there. And in another case, in Delhi, it is actually the intellectual people and lawyers that are driving this movement. A totally different situation is found in China. China has a very strong governance. The people have not much freedom, and they have more or less to obey what their headquarters say. And in this case, it is different. There, they had a lot of different units that were responsible for something, and they were all overlapping, and so no clear decision could be taken. Moreover, the people were afraid of their superiors, so rather than committing a mistake, they did better nothing. And now the river chief system is actually streamlining the entire area of action concerning rivers and lakes, and they have a lot of responsibility and they have a lot to say. They did not get additional money, but they get additional power, and then they can coordinate the restoration actions. And they were quite successful with this. For example, the stinky oxygen-free waters were practically eliminated all over China within 5 years. And so I'm trying to bring humans and nature together, as I said, with currently 4 PhD students, Alvin studying India, Ijin rivers in China, Raita River Congo, Tan in lakes in China, and my previous student, French student, Aude, is studying this phenomenon in Europe and specifically in Munich, as you can see here on the picture. We are working together to create human river or human wetland encounter sites, and these have different aspects which we recently published in sustainability, and we are always applying an all biodiversity perspective, which means we are not talking about humans or talking about ecosystems, we are talking about everything. We are talking about humans and biodiversity at the same time. So they have to provide habitat, they have to be healthy, they have to be safe, provide ecosystem functions, and for humans, they need to be sites for inspiration, for learning, and just for being marveled by the beauty of nature. They have to be collaborative and fight against this eco-social inequality. Eco-social fairness is very important. And lastly, resilience, which can be trained by living in pulsing environments. In the last part of my talk, I want to show you how we can learn from successful projects. A problem among many ecologists is that we are claiming, we are saying that something is going wrong, but we are not providing solutions. And we have to learn from successful other projects. And if a project has been successful, the results must be communicated in the best way possible, and people have to be invited to come over to these places. I will show you some examples now. So one fascinating example is the Manuelzão project in Belo Horizonte in the state of Minas Gerais in Brazil. It actually started with some medical people that said we have too many children dying from cholera, waterborne diseases which were caused, of course, by water pollution. And due to water pollution, the Rio das Velhas was also channelized. And then something very interesting happened. They found this old cowboy here, the Manuelzão, the upper left part of the graph. And they used him as a kind of landmark or a kind of spiritual leader. This very simple person guided then the people and attracted many more people, and more this project got an interdisciplinary project. So people were going down the river by kayak. They were making manifestations at the banks of the river. There was a lot of environmental education taking place, media, and so on. So in the case of this project, the elements that were leading the project to a success were a strong identification potential, a joint interest. As I said, public health care is very important. So the people were just simplifying the complex problem to one very visible symbol, being infant mortality, which is touching everybody. The people very often still had a cultural link to the river, and at the same time, they had a high level of education. Minas Gerais is one of the states in Brazil with the lowest levels of illiteracy. There was an excellent communication and very unusual public relations, for example, with kayaking, but also the mayor and the decision takers, they got very early interested in the project. And after a few years, 5 years, they supported it financially, as it was also pushed by a political background of the Eco 92. And today, with climate change, we again have this political background that is favorable. So we should really push things forward now. The river was quite big, so it had not been buried yet, and there was a big identification potential. And once the restoration had taken place, species could colonize it again from protected tributaries, and there was an excellent environmental education. So these are all favorable conditions for such a project. You do not need to have them all, but the more of them you have, the better it is. Will follow And the interesting lesson from the projects in India is that even the poorest of the poor, people that do not know what they will eat tomorrow, start taking action. And then it gets a big movement, and they started cleaning up a river, well, from solid waste, but they had thousands of tons of garbage removed, and it took many trucks to get out this stuff. And the domestic waste pollution, there are options for ecological wastewater treatment plants. There are the technologies, but it is important to know how to use them to avoid health risks, sanitary risks.
Okay, I think we are out of time, Matthias. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It is virtually, but it's the tool we have now, and it's better than nothing. Thank you very much for being so kind, sharing your knowledge, and we hope to see you again soon.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we can meet on Friday. Please just send me a short message with the exact starting date in Colombia, then I can find it out when it will be in European time. Yeah, and I put the homepage from my work on the chat. I hope you can read it there. You get the full publication list. And the River Culture Book will be freely available in UNESCO Press early next year. Okay, thank you all very much. Bye-bye.